Hey everyone, well it's time to do the dyno tune on the motorcycle today. If you followed along, whether it's here on my channel or over on the DynoJet YouTube channel, hopefully some combination of those, as well as checking out the blog posts, hopefully you've seen a lot and learned a lot about this kind of project and gotten an idea about whether it's something you might want to do yourself. Today is really where this all comes together. We've put on a lot of products that are going to help increase the airflow on the engine, and also put on the upgraded oil cooler to help keep the engine temperatures under control. And with all of these, we've kind of been talking about the other companies that have made these parts that are helping to make the engine more powerful. And we really haven't talked a whole lot about where DynoJet comes in. And today is really where it all comes together, and where the DynoJet products and expertise are going to turn this motorcycle and really transform the motorcycle. So we're going to be using a DynoJet Power Vision, and what that's going to allow Joe at Powerhouse Cycle and Dyno to do is actually make edits to the maps on the ECU to get a real full calibration. He can go in and he can change a bunch of the factory settings as well, so that some of the things that Harley put in that might have made sense for what they needed out of the motorcycle as a complete system don't necessarily apply when we've changed a bunch of parts on the motorcycle. And so if you're just using a canned piggyback kind of tuner setup, then you have a lot of limitations. You're not going to be able to go in and make these kinds of changes, and that's part of why my motorcycle didn't run all that well before I did the upgrades. The reality is, this dyno tune that we're doing today, I think I could have done before all of this and still seen a pretty big improvement and been a lot happier with the bike. Now, I'm going to be a whole lot happier with all this extra horsepower, and I'm sure you would be too. But the point is, what we're doing today is really the kind of thing that you should be looking at doing regardless of what you've done to your motorcycle to get the most out of it. So like I said, we're going to be using the DynoJet Power Vision, which is a fantastic product, and Joe's going to be able to do a lot to help get this bike exactly where it needs. Everything we've done so far has really been increasing the air portion of the air, fuel, and spark that you need to make horsepower, but we need more fuel, and I don't know if Joe's going to adjust the spark or not. He probably will a little bit, but really, way to think about it is that everything that we've done so far has been a supporting upgrade for what we're going to do today. A lot of times people think about it in the reverse of, this is the hardware that we've done, and the dyno tune, the DynoJet Power Vision is kind of a supporting upgrade. But in a lot of ways it's the reverse, because none of this is going to work without the fuel. It's a system and it all meshes together. So I'm not going to be riding the motorcycle over, because this tune is not at all correct for the engine, and I don't want to risk damaging the engine on the way. So we're just going to load it up on the trailer. S&S puts in the manual that they recommend a 500-mile break-in before you do a full-on high-power tune. There's different schools of thought on it. Mine is that I don't really like that method, just because you're not going to have a good tune. Maybe if you did have some kind of tuner that could do something better than what I have here already, that might get you a little bit closer, maybe that would be okay. I still don't think I would be very comfortable having taken all of this money and effort that I just put in and risking running it with a bad tune. The reality is, there's nothing wrong with breaking an engine on the dyno, and by the time Joe's done with the tune, it is going to be broken in. So after this, I'm going to pick it up from Joe once he's done with the tune. I'm going to drop it off with him, because the tune does take quite a while. And then next weekend, after I get the bike back, my wife and I are going to do a motorcycle trip with our two bikes for our anniversary, and that'll be a really great chance to see how this bike performs. So at the end of this video, I'll have some thoughts on that after I've put some miles on the bike. So let's get this thing loaded on the trailer and get it over to Powerhouse Cycle and Dyno. All right, so I'm back here at Powerhouse Dyno with Joe here, and we've got the dyno tune completed on my Harley. So initial, just looking at the dyno run, it looks really great. Joe, what are your thoughts on how the bike performed?
No, I think she performed extremely well. I mean, yeah, you got the 110 kit, good set of S&S cams in there, complete S&S exhaust. It pulled off the bottom really well. I think part of that is due to the combination and probably it having the 50 state legal emission setup on there, where it's got the catalytic converters and the mufflers, which did add a little bit more back pressure, so we didn't have a droop down here like I do see on a lot of setups with a really big open exhaust. So we don't have the droop right there. It pulls straight across and then boom, just starts taking off. So I mean, we've definitely got a good combination there that pulled together everything really, really well.
Yeah, and that's a good point on not having a droop from excess flow, because the velocity stays at a good point the whole way through, especially at the low range. So I'm really excited to see how it rides.
And it looks like, just taking a look at the curve, that there's a real steady horsepower and torque gain really just the entire way through the RPM band. And the other big thing I see is just how much smoother it looks, which I'm guessing between the ignition timing and the air-fuel ratios now being correct and optimized, that's where we see a lot of the smoothness, which I'm sure is going to translate into better driving characteristics.
Yeah, the biggest thing is, you know, I mean, everybody wants to shoot for a certain air fuel and stuff like that. A lot of times you just have to give the bike what it wants. So you may have a combination that for whatever reason it wants a richer air fuel down low and maybe just a hair bit leaner up top. And so initially I shoot for give it an even 13, give that as a baseline, see how that does. And then I add a little bit of fuel, make a run, see how it does, take away a little bit of fuel, see how it likes that. And sometimes you'll see, like down here in this area, it'll have a gain, it'll pick up, and then over here in this area, it may lose. So you're kind of picking and choosing, and you're giving the bike exactly what it wants for air fuel, whether that be, you know, 12.5 or, you know, 13.4, you know, somewhere in that range. Usually a Harley will eat that up perfectly fine, but it's just figuring out exactly how much it wants and where. But there's no exact air fuel that you're always shooting for a good performing wide open throttle pull. It's give the bike what it wants. And then on top of that, getting the ignition timing set correctly so that it's happy with what it wants. And then usually, you know, it's kind of picking and choosing on that, because the other thing that you always got to think of is that, you know, you're using the fuel that you filled up with that day at that point in time, and then you go somewhere else and the fuel's a little bit different. So these things will always change a little bit just based off of fuel. So you also have to be kind of conservative with some of your air fuel numbers and some of your ignition timing numbers because of that, to make sure that you're still not going to be having any kind of runability issues or any kind of knocking and pinging and stuff like that in the future.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to riding it and seeing all of the improvements along the way, and just how much better, not just how much more power and torque it's going to make, but just how much better I think it's going to ride. Because I don't know if you remember, but some of my complaints when I brought it in weren't just that I wanted more horsepower. It was also just that there were some areas where it was pretty clear that it wasn't, it seemed like it was running okay, but not as well as it could.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's I mean, running on what you had before, I mean, you had a kind of a stage 1 setup before, if I remember correctly, but just looking at the graph from where it was before, we could see that, you know, she was pretty nasty before, and, you know, whether, you know, the air fuel was definitely off, ignition timing was probably off, so there was a lot of things that weren't going right for it, and now we've corrected that on top of having a definite engine boost. You know, you bumped up in cubic inches, you got a good cam in there, you know, the exhaust on there is definitely a good performer and has a great sound to it, not overly bearingly loud, and definitely louder than stock. And so it's kind of the best of all worlds in one combination. I mean, even just looking at the torque curve, that's a nice cushy looking torque curve that I like to see. It's not, you know, just something that pops off the very bottom and then runs out of breath at, you know, 3,500, 4,000, or vice versa, where, you know, horsepower, you know, it doesn't start making anything until, you know, 4,000, 4,500, 5,000. So most riders like having what I call the meat and potatoes ride, where you get most of your, you know, your peak torque and everything's hitting really good and running really well right in the middle and right where you're really wanting it.
Yeah, and so really, and what makes all of this happen isn't just it's a combination of having the right parts on the bike, having a good dyno and a good dyno operator that knows how to do the tune. But key piece of equipment here is the DynoJet Power Vision, because without this, what you're stuck with is kind of like what I had before, which was a piggyback computer, and those things, they have their place and they can do some things, but you know, when you're talking about wanting to change ignition timing, fueling, and all of the other parameters, this is what lets you go in and make all of the edits, just like they did at Harley, to make the bike what it needs to be. And without this kind of tool, you're throwing a lot of money at hardware, but you're not going to ultimately get what you need out of the bike to make it run the way it should. And this is where having a good computer setup like the Power Vision makes this possible. So I'm really glad that we were able to use this, and thanks to DynoJet for giving us the ability to use the Power Vision on the bike. I can't wait to ride it. I know it's going to be a much better experience than what I had, and after I ride it, I'll do some more reports. So thanks again, Joe. Appreciate everything you've done to help on the bike.
All right, well, we got the motorcycle back from Joe at Powerhouse Dyno. Let's take her for a ride. We got her all warmed up. Let's see how she does. I'm really happy with how this motorcycle is performing. A couple of notes about differences now versus before. Joe was saying that 3,000 or so is about where this thing really starts to get happy, and when you look at the dyno chart, that makes sense. It still does pretty well down low, thanks in part to the exhaust, which helps to keep the exhaust velocity, back pressure, all that where it needs to be for lower end performance. It's kind of interesting that the 50 state legal with the catalytic converters in it sort of helps that. Kind of the opposite of what most people are going for. Most people just go for the loudest, highest flow that they can find. What Joe was saying, really a lot of times that actually makes for a worse riding experience, and he was really impressed with how this worked out. I have to say, I love the sound of it. This thing, normally I'm not a huge fan of how catalytic converter exhausts sound, but S&S really did a great job on this. You've still got all the right Harley sounds. It doesn't sound kind of neutered like a lot of times vehicles with catalytic converters do, and you have all the performance that you need, and all the performance, all the sound that you want. There's more than enough flow with this exhaust, because if you think about it, you're still making about 105 horsepower, but you've got enough flow to really be able to support probably closer to 200 if you think about it. So you have all the flow you need. You still got a great sound. I'm really happy with this. Just when you do a roll-on like that, it's amazing. The bike doesn't feel anemic and underpowered like it did before. It's really got a great kick. You can tell with these bigger cams that really it wants to be above 2,000 RPM, and really 2,500 or above is where it starts to really get happy, and you can feel that. That's a lot of where the 110-inch big bore kit comes in to really help things out. If you did the cams by themselves, that would make probably a pretty similar horsepower improvement, probably not quite as high, especially with the stock heads. But with the big bore kit, now you get that helps to bring down that torque curve a little bit, so that you don't find yourself having to rev the bike quite so high. If you had a lighter weight bike, and of course these are Harleys, none of them are all that lightweight, but if you had not an Ultra Classic, the biggest, heaviest one that they make, you probably wouldn't necessarily mind the 96-inch with the bigger cams, and that would certainly be an option if you want to do the work yourself, but maybe save a little bit of money, and maybe you don't want to go quite as in depth into the engine as I did. I'm doing, I'm not trying hard to go fast. This is just kind of a normal roll on, and this is part of what I really like about how this is working now, is that you don't feel like you have to really downshift and work the engine hard to get the horsepower out of it that you want. I'm going to get on the highway now, and let's do a little bit more of a hard pull with that. Get ourselves straightened out a little bit. Is just absolutely incredible. This thing is so much fun to roll on now. It's still a big and heavy bike. You're never going to get the kind of acceleration that you would get off of a leader class sport bike, but it just kind of feels like it has this massive push when you roll into it. There's no shortage of power at all. Jay Leno's Garage, a lot of times he talks about kind of a feeling like the hand of God pushing you, and this is kind of what it has now. When you roll into it, it just has torque for days. And right there I just did a pull from about 45 up to about 75 in 5th gear. No need to downshift, it just worked just fine. When you think about it, at 45 we're doing about 2,500 RPM in 5th gear, which is pretty comfortable. You probably wouldn't want to go to the 6th gear with it at this point, just because it's a little bit it gets a little bit on the bottom end of where the cams start to kick in and perform. But the thing is, if you look at the torque at the dyno chart, this is where the torque really starts to come in and really starts to it's really where the engine starts to come into its own. And if you think about it, that's what you want out of a motorcycle that you're riding on the street. You don't really want something that's going to be super peaky, super high RPM. At least, certainly not on a big heavy bike. When you have a sport bike, maybe it's a little bit different. But when you're riding one of these, it's big, it's heavy, you want something that's got good torque, down low, where you're going to use it when you're riding on the street. It's perfectly comfortable up at highway speeds. Speed limit's 75 here, and it's not even breaking a sweat doing that. Really makes me want to do a cannonball run, or not a cannonball run, that would be different, that would be something else, but this really makes me want to do an iron butt run with how well this thing performs. I feel like it would be a great bike for it. You know, before, the bike would go 85 or above, but you felt like you were kind of at full throttle to make that happen. I think some of that had to do with just how lean the bike was with that canned tune. Now it's at a nice happy mixture. You're nowhere near full throttle to be cruising along at 75, 85 miles an hour, kind of a speed you'd want to go at. You set the cruise control. I do notice a little bit about how the cruise control doesn't quite behave the same. It's a little bit rougher when you engage it and when you disengage it. And I think that's just because when they programmed it around the stock horsepower, and so the throttle is more sensitive than it was before. This heavier clutch that Joe put in, it is heavier. It does take a little bit more hand strength now. You get used to it really quickly though, and it's not bad at all. I think that was a good idea, and that's something that I think I should have done just outright and not tried to mess around with it. You know, in the past I've had pretty good luck most of the time with pushing more than stock horsepower out of a stock clutch, but this is a lot more than stock horsepower. And from what Joe was saying, that basically, even if it's working now and even if it makes it through the dyno, I was going to end up burning it up really quick. So makes sense to just get it done. I should have done it in the first place. When you take a look at it, this was a big project. I had cylinders to do with pistons, camshafts, oil pump, oil support plate, exhaust, intake. Now the exhaust and intake, that you kind of had to do anyway just because you were taking the cylinders off. Oil cooler, dyno tune, but then you got some of the other stuff like the clutch, the spark plugs and wires. Now I kind of had to do those anyway, it was time for them. But one of the nice things is that a lot of times it's easy to sort of forget about some of these details, and so now I've got the bike all freshened up and it's going to be ready to ride for a long time. I would be 100% comfortable taking it on an iron butt run, and if you want me to do that, put it in the comments, and maybe we'll be able to make it happen. Might not be this year at this point because it's already mid-September, and what kind of came to my mind would be to try to do if I did this, would be the 1,500 mile in a day going to the Portofino Inn in California, which if you followed the Cannonball Run history, that was where they ended up. I'm kind of right halfway between on that route here in Kansas. Maybe I do another route, but now that I'm doing this, it sure is an appealing idea. The motorcycle could absolutely do it. I would have complete confidence in its durability. Comfortable going full throttle in first gear. These tires grip fantastic. I'm really glad that I put them on, but to give you an idea of just how much torque there is, when my wife and I were riding around Branson, which I didn't get video there because it started raining a lot, and so we got our ride cut short a bit. But in fourth gear at one point I rolled on the throttle just a bit, and not even at a high RPM, and the back tire broke loose. And I've never had that happen on this motorcycle in 9 years of ownership. It's never broken the tire loose, period. And all I had before were the stock Harley tires, which they're pretty good, but they're definitely not as good of a grip as these Pirelli Night Dragons are. So gotta get a little bit more comfortable with the first gear, but you know, you don't drag race one of these things, at least I don't. If I want to go fast, I got other things for that. Really, when I take a look at just how good of a tune this is, it's a real testament to DynoJet, the Power Vision, the DynoJet dyno that Joe was using, and Joe's capabilities as a dyno tuner. And you really need all of these things to come together, because there's all the different levers that you have when you're doing engine tuning, and if you're only hitting a couple of those levers, then you're just not going to have as good of a result. You need to be able to do the fueling, the ignition timing, and then you got all these other things that it's just gotten so much more complicated since the days of a mechanical advance and setting the base timing on a distributor or pickup or whatever you're using, and then the jets on a carb. And of course, the jets on the carbs are where DynoJet started out initially, hence their name, DynoJet. But when you take a look at these days, you've got things like these automatic extra enrichments that come in if you're at full throttle for a long time, and all of these little extra things, and it's useful to have, and a lot of times they're put in there because from the factory they need it to meet emissions purposes or something like that. Well, that's kind of embarrassing getting passed by the UPS truck. But he's in more of a hurry than I am, I guess. And with the Power Vision, you really get to manipulate all the different levers that the ECU has in it to make the motorcycle run the way that it should. You have, especially these days with emissions, you have all kinds of different levers and settings and things like that they serve a purpose, but when you go to get a good dyno tune like what we've done here, you most of the time want to be able to turn them off, or at the very least you want to change how they work a little bit. And that's part of the problem that was happening with the piggyback tune, or the piggyback computer that I had before. You just didn't have access access to any of those. All that you were doing was changing a couple of the things that the ECU was seeing. And so when you did that, okay, you were able to get a little bit more fuel, not enough more fuel, and ultimately the ECU was still mostly just not doing a very good job with the engine. But now everything's working exactly the way that it should. So I really can't say enough good things about how well this motorcycle runs now, and I'm very happy with the end result. It's got a nice smooth power application. It's definitely snappier than it was before. I'd say maybe the only thing I noticed that's a little bit negative is the cruise control, like I mentioned before, but it still works just fine for holding the bike steady. It's just more that when you start to make some adjustments and when it comes on or off, it's definitely more abrupt. But that's really not unexpected, and that's a pretty minor thing. Maybe it could get tuned out, maybe not. But the throttle by wire does still behave very nicely and very linearly. It's not hard to control at all, and if you've ridden, some leader class sport bikes where you got, a millimeter of travel can be enough to practically throw you off your seat. And when you're talking about something like this, you don't have that level of sensitivity. So it still maintains a really nice, easy to ride motorcycle. It just gives you all the power that it really needs to help make it more fun and really be safer, because let's face it, a lot of times when you're riding out on the road, sometimes acceleration is your friend to get out of a bad spot. And that was really one thing that I never liked about how the motorcycle was before, is that there's some situations where I could see some traffic up ahead and thinking about what the people were going to do, and you do all these things as a good rider. You take a look at what's going to happen, and then you think about, okay, what's my out going to be? And I never had the out of acceleration before. Now there's actually enough power that, not in all cases, but in some cases, acceleration can still be a way out of a jam. The torque really is phenomenal. I'm sorry I can't get the audio working better. I hope that it still sounds good, or at least good enough that we can post it. I wish that I could get it working well enough that I could do a good real highway cruise where I'm really using the power, but hopefully you get an idea between some of these pulls that we did. I definitely hit the speed limit when I did that pull going onto the highway, which was 75, maybe just a little bit over.
So this concludes the Building the Thunder series sponsored by DynoJet. I hope that you've enjoyed it, whether you've been watching it here on my channel or on the DynoJet YouTube channel, some combination, reading the blogs. I hope that this content's been really fun for you to watch. Hope you've learned something. I know that I have. I just got back from doing the ride on the bike from some of the video that you just saw, and really riding this motorcycle now puts a big smile on my face, something that it still put a smile on my face before, but just having this total performance package and getting all the capabilities and the power curve and sound and everything that I always wanted it to have, but it didn't. It just makes riding so much more enjoyable. I really have complete confidence in the setup. So far I've only put about 400 miles on it, so it's not like I put a lot of miles on it, but it's started up great, worked without a hiccup. The oil pressure is fantastic, much better than it ever was before, and everything just sounds good. Everything looks good. Nothing to complain about. So what am I going to do next? Well, kind of like I was saying on the ride, hopefully the audio was good enough to get that part in. Maybe I'll do an iron butt run with it. I've always wanted to do that, and now this bike is really how I would like it to be to do something like that. Before it would go 75, 85, but wasn't super comfortable doing that. It felt like you were really working the engine hard at that. Now, with all of the extra power, it doesn't feel overstressed at all to be doing some of these faster highway speeds. It just feels like you set the cruise control and it's comfortable. So, having done all this, I guess final impressions are that I think DynoJet and S&S put together a fantastic package. Great combination of S&S parts plus the Harley oil cooler, and the DynoJet Power Vision is really what brought this all together, combined with the DynoJet Dyno and Joe at Powerhouse Dyno doing the tune. So looking back on the whole process, I don't think I would change a thing. The parts were great. Maybe the only thing I would have changed is that now, knowing what I know, I would have ordered some of the special tools and maybe a couple of the gaskets and things ahead of time that I found were not included that I was going to need. I definitely would have put the clutch in while I had the motorcycle here and was working on it, instead of waiting until I got to the dyno. And that really just makes sense. I mean, you're putting so much more horsepower out of this thing, you're going to want a stronger clutch. So that was something I should have thought about beforehand. These Pirelli Night Dragon tires I'm really happy with as well. That was a good supporting upgrade, especially because my tires were older and they needed to get replaced anyway. And Joe had recommended to go with the V-Rod spark plugs, which are one heat range colder. So if you think about spark plugs, remember that you want a cold plug for a hot engine and a hot plug for a cold engine. So this engine's a lot hotter now with all the extra horsepower, so that makes sense. Seems to be a good choice. It runs beautifully and works really well at high power. So once again, I'd like to thank DynoJet for letting me do this and letting me share this with you, and I hope that you've really enjoyed it. If there's any other questions that you have or anything else that you'd like to see from this motorcycle now that I'm done with the official work of the project, make sure to leave it in the comments. Let me know what you'd like to see, and do my best to post it for you if I can. So thanks again for watching. Have a great day.